I'm delighted to introduce as our guest speaker a fellow environmental scientist, although, as you're about to hear, far more eminent than I ever was. Professor Emeritus John St James Stewart Buckridge, BSc, MSc, is a geologist. He's undertaking research in marine biology, New Zealand and France, led to publication of over 200 books and articles in paleo. John co-founded the International Society of Zoological Sciences, Beijing, and was the first president of the society. He's lectured in this field at universities in China, Australia, Denmark, England, Fiji, France, Germany, New Zealand, Norway, Scotland, Sweden and USA. It's amazing. And John has actually just come back from China, and before that in October he was in Germany. So his topic is management of marine reserves in Australasia. Over to John.
Thank you, John. It was interesting to hear the comments from John Syme a few minutes ago, and I just spoke to him briefly about what he had said, because the meeting I was at in China was to do with conservation, and it was also to do with artificial intelligence. And we were fated in the great hall of the academy there. I had the chance to sit down beside the founder of Alibaba. And those of you that may know of Alibaba, it's one of the biggest social networking companies in the world. It's sort of like Google, but it's Chinese. And one of the things that we spoke about there was the impact that artificial intelligence has. Hence the interest I had with hearing what John was saying a few minutes ago. So you might say, what has any of this got to do with marine reserves? I was asked to speak about this in Germany, first of all. It's quite interesting because if you walk around and look out across Port Phillip and you compare that with what it's like looking out across the Ostsee, which is where the Baltic Sea is, it looks very similar. And we have similar rock appearances, not the rock types, but similar appearances of rocks and things. And some of the problems they have there are similar to the ones that we have here. So it was quite nice to talk about how we are managing our resources in Australia compared with what is happening in Germany. I'm not going to talk about every site in Australia. I've got three, one in Western Australia, here, one down here at Rickett's Point. So we've got two urban and one rural reserve, one in Western Australia. I think it was last week at one of Roger's groups, and I decided for that one that I wouldn't put in the Western Australian one, but I thought you would like to see that. Now, the big question I've asked here is, why do we live by the sea? Why live here? If we look at Australia, there is no question about Australians love living near the water. And of course, if you go to the UK, you find that everybody lives within 60 miles of the water, because they can't, we're living where else is so small. But with Australia, we have an excuse. We could go and live in Alice if we wanted to, but most of us live on the coast. And there are many reasons for that. And I think that there is something inherent in humans. They like to be by the water, and as a consequence, that is where we have established a number of these marine sanctuaries and reserves. I thought I'd put this quite nice to reflect a bit on your history. And you are all children of this, and you're looking at it with mouths open, which is kind of interesting, because this is from the North Pole Dome, which is the oldest rock in the world that contains fossils. And the fossils in this are cyanobacteria, and they are our direct ancestors. And in fact, if you wanted to, you could imagine that let me see where they are. There is sort of a filamented or layered surface with bits of bobbing up and slowing down. That is what's left of them. What's interesting about these is that from Pilbara, this place called North Pole Dome, which is a really great name, they are 3.41 billion years old. And as I've said here, they are the progenitive, in other words, they are our ancestors. So we're looking at our ancestors. What's interesting about Western Australia? Now these are stromatolites. They are in a reserve, a sanctuary. They are important because they are a unique ecosystem. They are living stromatolites, and what is really curious about this is that they are exactly the same type of organisms as the image you saw a few minutes ago. So what has happened in Western Australia, and we never know exactly how things have developed over the last 3.5 billion years, but there is a continuity. In other words, there is a sequence of events that have occurred in Western Australia right through from the earliest life forms on Earth, our ancestors, to today. There are questions that we want to ask. Of course, you may say, why are they still there? Why didn't they all evolve as humans? And this is a very good question to ask yourself. How come they still live as cyanobacteria? Some of them changed into us. Obviously, there's quite a series of sequences and pathways before they became humans, but nonetheless, that was what it was all about. So they live in what's called alkaline and nutrient poor conditions. And this ecosystem lasted for 3.4 billion. Now, they've decided they've put a series of walkways around these, which is great, but you would think that even with signs up there, people would be encouraged not to do any damage. Yet the top picture up here shows where people have been hurling rocks at them, and the bottom one, rocks have been thrown in the middle of it, and there's a footprint there right up to the edge of it. Why would you do that? I don't know, but when I drive along the Nepean Highway and I see road signs that have been heavily graffitied, I can see why they've been done, but I don't know the rationale for it. And then again, this is not necessarily from that. This is a stromatolite, but that's not, I'm sure, it's probably not Magnetis, maybe further north. But is this good science, or is it simply vandalism? There was no need to get in there with a sword and cut these things up like that. So I stress that these things here have been around, and if we were to put the number of zeros after the 3.4, it's huge. And I think it's really important to hammer that home. That is the first evidence of life on Earth. They had no idea that it was organic until they found those stromatolites in Western Australia, and they were able to extrapolate backwards. So this Ricketts Point, the marine sanctuary here, was established in 2002. It's important for ecological protection, and these are the Australian rules. It's a biodiversity hotspot, and it also has a paleontological value. There are interesting fossils there. Some of the earliest marsupial fossils are found at this location. To give you an idea of the sort of things we can see, there are a range of marine invertebrates and algae in the water, fantastic avian fauna, beautiful birds, and you've all seen these before. Here are some of the fossils. I should point out that the fossil in the top left, that's George III tuppence, so they've been there for quite a while. 1797. So the rationale for Ricketts Point is to protect the biodiversity and cultural heritage of the site, to provide educational and recreational opportunities to contribute to Victoria's representative system of marine protected areas. So there is a rationale behind where they selected these particular sanctuaries and reserves, and we are hopefully covering most of the important areas in Victoria. So Australia's policy is to preserve these representative ecosystems, to foster education, cultural recognition and access, and to connect people to conservation. Pretty good ideas. Has it been successful? This was the shot, by the way, I showed the Germans. Well, there is a very diverse and thriving avian fauna, and there's increased bony fish in particular. One particular fish, a wrasse, here it is, has a name. And I have a colleague who knows it quite well, and it knows him, and it comes and talks to him when he goes diving in the area. But both fish and birds are transitory. They can fly in and fly out, or swim in and swim out very, very quickly indeed. Another example, this is one of the greater crested terns. So the causation and effect, has it been successful? Well, I took the photograph on the left-hand side in 2024, and on the right-hand side in October this year, just before I went to Germany. And if you go and have a look at this type of environment, this algae is up to a metre, maybe sometimes places more than a metre thick. And if you go and you stick your hands into this in other places, you will find that when you break it apart, there are arthropods and other small crustaceans in it that are devouring it. Ricketts Point, there aren't. You might be very lucky and see one, but normally if you go to a beach and open them up, they're just leaping out. We call them as sandhoppers. They are there in their thousands, and they break it down. If it doesn't have those present, what is happening is it begins to degrade, and bacteria that John was talking about before get in there, and you get the smell and the nastiness associated with it. I was at a council meeting on one of their committees to do with, I think it's called Bayside Healthy Aging Reference Group, and they pointed out that they had actually supplied, I don't know whether they did this one, did they provide this one? They said they had paid for the audio-visual recording system for Probus. It was wonderful, but they also pointed out that these types of sessions were pivotal for keeping people active and involved when you get a bit older. I didn't say that I was speaking today, but kind of interesting. And I said, well, look, we live on the coast. That's why it's called Bayside. Surely the bay itself is an important part of our lifestyle. And I said, I'm really curious because this is a reserve or a sanctuary. It means that we are not allowed to take things out of it other than photographs and memories. But I said, the build-up of the algae here is quite enormous in some places. And I said, couldn't there be a possibility of us taking some of it away, at least, and they're going to put it through to their so-called expert committee, which I'm not sure what that means, but it's going to go into. And the next thing, which is kind of interesting, is that I took my grandchildren down to the beach to the Surf Lifesaving Club, and they were told that don't go for a swim. This was last Sunday because the algae is there, and caught up in the algae, or sea eggs, they've got long spines. Kids run across this algae, they don't know these are in it, and they will go right up to the foot. So there are health issues to do with this here. So I raised these, so we'll see what happens with our lack of authority. But why are these things absent? And of course, there's a diminished barnacle. I'll show you this in a few seconds. There are amphipods that we normally expect to see. Now, I didn't put a live one, it's been jumping around. The bottom photograph there is from Black Rock. So Black Rock is closer to the city, and you think maybe would be more polluted, but the barnacles grow there. And that shot on the right-hand side is of the same height on the seashore as the one on the left, but the one on the right is from Ricketts Point. So there's something wrong. There's an absence of key. Now, the seaweed is a big cause. It's typically found in sheltered reefs and seagrass. Some species are highly invasive and they can grow up to 10 millimeters, and their growth rate is enhanced by fertilizer runoff. I think this is an interesting thing as well, because we get sometimes enthusiastic builders connect the wrong pipes up to stormwater, and we get more than simply stormwater coming out of these pipes.
Yeah.
I would normally expect to see those sort of things covered in barnacles, but they're not. So what are we doing? We're trying to understand the system. And I've had student research down there looking at the water composition, looking at the presence or absence of certain types of chemicals. We've also started citizen science monitoring. There are a few groups that are doing that. Citizen science monitoring is very, very important, because what it does do is it gets locals involved. If you own something, you're more likely to take care of it than if you don't feel you own it. But this is the rather interesting question. Who's in charge of the Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary? Is it Parks Victoria? Is it Bayside City Council? Is it the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action Change, or whatever the hell that is? That last one, they keep changing their name. I think it's called DECA now. Anybody from DECA here? What's kind of interesting is that if you want to ensure that nothing happens with anything, get a committee that's fairly large, or get a number of bodies to have ownership over it. It's almost impossible to get anything done. They all have their own little bit of it that they control, and they are very quick and very able to say, well, look, that's not our area. That part, we're not area. That part is just outside our area of responsibility. Talk to Parks, or Bayside, or DECA. So one of the things that I would like to see is for these groups to be amalgamated in the way in which they look after sanctuary. You don't need to have a huge committee, but you do need to have a very, very clear relationship of who's responsible and who's accountable. Now, they will all say that we know exactly what our responsibilities are and our accountability, therefore, is this. But it doesn't help, because the place is degraded, and it shouldn't be as bad as it is. I'm fascinated when I go down there, when I look at often they have people down there with dogs. Now, we've had dogs for many, many years, and they chase the birds. And they're not supposed to chase the bird. And I remember going up to somebody who had a very large, aggressive-looking dog down a no dog tied-up area, and it had just defecated on the sand. And we had our children down there, and I said, look, grandchildren here. And he said, listen, old man, if I want to be down here and do this, I'll do it. So I thought, wow, I had forgotten that I was. But let's have a look. We're still on Ricketts Point. Somebody said to me, I do hope you're going to talk about Ricketts Point. Well, here is the Greater Crested Tern. It's migratory. And it's really kind of interesting looking at that picture there. We can see that it comes down from China to Australia, up to Indochina, and also there's a subspecies that goes down to South Africa. And I suspect what happens is as they're subspecies, they're probably capable of breeding. So why have I put that up? Well, one of the things that citizen science does is it allows us to keep a close watch on things that are happening in a marine reserve or sanctuary. And there are a lot of very enthusiastic volunteers who go down there and take photographs. But there's this disease called SFTSV. It's a new, potentially pandemic disease that originated in China and which causes fever with thrombocytopenia and multi-organ failure that can lead to death. And people are dying of it in China. Ticks are the likely carriers of the virus, and ticks are transported on birds. So that's why it's very important for us to know what's going on in these sanctuaries and reserves, even if it's just to protect ourselves. We had a whole series of sessions on this new disease. It doesn't have a proper name yet. It's a very new one. As I said, some people have already died of it in China. So we'll come back to Ricketts Point in a few minutes. I want to go and have a look at another one that's even more than what they've done. And this is in New Zealand, a place called Long Bay. But the Kiwis are pretty smart. They were the first in the world to legislate for marine sanctuaries and parks, which they did in 1995, and this was one of the first ever established. So what is it for? It has diverse habitats, safeguards the fauna in those, and it is for education and research. Outdoor classroom is how they see it. So the rationale for the New Zealand one is to provide areas free from extraction, that's the fishing, for research, recovery, and public demonstration, to demonstrate the effectiveness of no-take reserves. Their policy is science first, provide areas free from extraction, and to demonstrate that no-take reserves actually work. And what you would say is, Kiwis have got it right. Brilliant, isn't it? I mean, nod happily, agree with me in this one. This is a great start. This is what you want to do, isn't it? No take. It's interesting, there was huge opposition when this one was established from fishermen. Now they're very happy because it's seen as a potential spawning area. It's much bigger than Ricketts Point. But it's very important. Okay, now here comes the rub. There's the beach. It's a beautiful spot, and this is what they did. That's directly adjacent to the beach. Now, I'm sure you can make it what's happening there. They've taken away all the topsoil, and when it rains in Auckland every day. And here is a council or authority approved system to trap silt waste, and the gap between the hay bales is pretty obvious. I did simple experiments there. We took some of the stuff that's coming down. On the left-hand side is what happens with that silt in fresh water. When you take the silt and put it into seawater, after 2 hours, I don't know whether you can see that very well from there, but it just flocculates and drops to the bottom. So what happens is the sodium and calcium ions and magnesium ions in sea hook onto the clay molecules and drag them to the bottom. They cause them to group together and they settle at the bottom. In the marine reserve, this is not good. That thing at the bottom there, yeah, good arrow, that's a settlement plate. And that settlement plate, I had some students put in to see what was happening and what was living in the area and how it was impacting the environment. Everything on it was dead, and the smell was quite interesting too. Now, this happened almost a quarter of a century ago, and by happenstance, a person called and said, I've just found out where these reef balls are placed. Now these reef balls, I got permission to put these in, and they're pretty big, as you can see there. They're made of concrete, they're hollow, and they were put out, and this is what they're like this particular year, after almost a quarter of a century sitting out there. So are they working? Well, let's have a look. The silt remains a problem. The individual standing there in the bottom of the ocean, he's put his foot down and disappeared. And that is the colour of the sea water out there at that depth. That's about 10 metres out. Now, most of the people who enjoy Long Bay do so in the shallow waters close to the edge and don't get out into deep water. But this is not healthy. Why? Well, the politics comes into it. The Minister of Conservation says the Department of I have to get this one right, don't I? The Department of Conservation will not use the marine reserve as the basis for opposing future residential development of the area. So what he says is that you have the marine reserve, but we're going to build and we're going to excavate, and we're going to put houses and so on. Those are the buildings they put in. As you can see, it's pretty high intense building. So when it rains, that clay goes straight into the water. But they still get some things right. Success in conservation, especially in urban settings, must be underpinned by education and through community ownership and involvement and through policing. Now, we don't do that well here at all. The Kiwis do that, and they have a ranger station, a permanent station on site, and we need to have something similar here if we want to be serious about preserving our natural environment. So, just to finish up, what have some of us been doing about places like Ricketts Point? Well, education. And the first one is that we decided we must have a system where people can look at a book, take it out in the field, and identify the things that are in the sanctuary. And there are a series of 6 of these are published. This particular one is the fossils. The next one is on the algae and marine invertebrates. I only put up 3 of these just so you get a bit of a feeling for them. And the style is the same in every one. We've got a picture of the organism. There's some comments about how abundant they are, where they've come from, whether they are endemic or whether they are invaders. And here is one on the most recent one. This one is on the mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. What else it does, which is kind of fun, is being an author in all of these books, one of the authors, you can use it to promote some science. And you'll be fascinated to know that there is that dolphin I showed you on the front cover of that book. If that dolphin were to swim out of Victorian waters into South Australia, or up to New South Wales, it would have a different scientific name. So it can change its name, no deed poll required, just swim across the border and name change it. The reason is because scientists, biologists in Victoria think it's a separate species. Those in New South Wales and South Australia say it's not. Kind of interesting. But what's also fascinating about this is that I have a bit of a go. There's a guy by the way, I won't say his name because apparently the last person who spoke his name in public ended up in court. But he is an Australian. He has his own journal. It's the Journal of Herpetology. And he publishes new names in it continuously for species in and around Australia. What he does is he names them after his friends and his pets and so on. And he is throwing the entire taxonomic world into disarray. I'm on an international taxonomy committee and we are trying to deal with these taxonomic vandals or cowboys, and it makes it very difficult if you get people like this. By the way, I should explain to you that if you have a journal and it's refereed, in principle that means it's passed some sort of scientific rigorous test, so it's okay. Well, he's broken all the rules and it's causing havoc. And these little books give a chance to sort of bring people up to speed some of the things we're facing. And here are the whole series of books. I'm told that we have now the most fully covered marine sanctuary as far as literature is concerned, probably in Australia, maybe one of the best in the world. Now what's also interesting is all of these books here have been supported by the International Union of Biological Sciences in Paris, and they're all available free download. And that's important. In other words, if you've got access to a computer system, you can download these for nothing. But if you want to buy a copy, and some of them are quite large, it's much cheaper to go to a place like Beaumaris Books and get a copy there rather than have a colour Xerox of a 200-page book.
Yes.
So both options are there. So coming to conclusions, New Zealand pioneered the science-first no-take areas. Victoria adopted community plus representative networks, and their joint legacy, no-take policies for representative marine ecosystems. My final slide is success in establishing and maintaining reserves and sanctuaries is not to be achieved quickly. It takes time and education, both of citizens and of government. Thank you.
Just before I call for questions from the floor, I was wondering if I could ask a question myself. John, you mentioned that you've just come from a conference in China, at which AI was discussed. Could you tell us about what's happening in AI and biological sciences in China?
Well, it's a very good question, too. When we talk about AI, well, there was an article in The Australian last weekend by, not Jeremy Clarkson, but his offsider. I don't know what his name is, I forgot, it doesn't matter. But he wrote about the fact that there's a thing called P-doom. P, and the word doom is in brackets. And there's a time when they take over. And I was quite fascinated, I've never heard of this. This is when AI takes over. And a number of people like Mark Zuckerberg and others have come up with the idea that it's probably going to be 2027 or 2028. Absolutely stunned me. They say that the reason why it's going to happen is because artificial intelligence is now learning how to lie. Now, what's interesting about that is that quite often when you go and use it, what I do is I do use it, I'll put in a question, and I know enough to know whether the answer is correct or not. So I might put in a question like, how many species of arachnids did Darwin describe? And to my knowledge, Darwin described none. But it might come back with a whole list of species. Then you go into it and you say, no, they are not correct. They were described by somebody or other else. Then it says, oh, I'm sorry, you're correct. And I've done this a number of times, and you can go through about 10 different iterations with AI. And presumably it's learning. But what's interesting is that if I'd asked it a question and it came up with an answer and I didn't know that Darwin hadn't described those, I would assume it was correct because there's a tendency to believe what you read and see. Otherwise the whole system collapses. So as far as that's concerned, I thought that's really interesting. It's getting better and it can't lie yet. I asked that question, by the way. For the next question, I straight in, I said, can artificial intelligence lie? So it came back and said, no, it can't. It can be programmed to deceive, which is an interesting. So I thought I'd leave you with that little bit. And then I knew I was going to come here and talk about this. So I thought, there's another question I will ask it, and that is that what is the most precious thing on earth? Now, you're all sitting thinking to yourself, my lawnmower. But what is really interesting is that it came back with an answer I thought was quite good. It depends upon the context. Fair enough. You know, you might say that the most precious thing is human culture. You might say a whole lot of other things. You may say it's the royal family. Probably most of us would. So the rather interesting thing, it came back and said, please give me a category. So I did. And I said, in science. Now, what do you think the most important, actually where they had no difficulty, came straight out, fruit. Some of you are looking at this here covetously. It's not a pizza, by the way. In here is a specimen. And this is what it said, it's the most precious thing on earth. And it's in my hand. Any ideas as to what it might be? I'm trying to get people to really appreciate this. There it is, it's a piece of rock. What's really interesting about this piece of rock is that it contains amino acids. It is a carbonaceous it's a meteorite. When it formed, there was no sun. So this is older than our sun and our solar system. And it fell in Mexico, this particular one, in 1963. So artificial intelligence pointed out this is perhaps the most precious object on the planet. Now you might say, well, okay, why? And how do they know it's pre-solar? It actually uses that term pre-solar. Well, it contains really peculiar minerals and compounds, xenon isotopes, some strange things indeed. But the things in here are little round circular things. They contain things that are not from our sun or our solar system. And just to get you really excited, it contains nanodiamonds. But anyway, I'll leave it here.
And amino acids.
And amino acids, yeah. So they are those, that there. How old is it? Well, somebody asked that question. I'll give you the exact date. 4.65 billion years old. And I brought along the specimen I showed you before, and here it is. This is from North Pole in Western Australia, and it's up the right way. So this is the oldest living organisms on the planet, and these almost certainly are derived from amino acids that arrived on meteorites like that. So there you are.
Another question, John.
Yeah.
Down at Rickett, in the no take thing that you highlighted in both New Zealand and Australia, down at Rickett's Point, there's a special place where all the divers can go, which is a ramp.
Yeah. Disabled.
And I was down there yesterday, actually, having a look at it again, about the 50,000th time. What stops those divers for taking something from the Rickett's Point Sanctuary and taking it home?
Nothing really. There's a sign saying don't collect. Every now and then somebody from Parts Victoria goes down, but they're not there all the time. And I remember I was down earlier this year, where the triangular trick station is out there, and there were a series of squat lobsters. Now squat lobsters are quite interesting. They are about this big, and they're orange coloured, and they're swimming around. They are very nice to eat. And there were some people who were standing, and I stupidly said to them, look, there's about 10 of them now moving around, and I said, they are squat lobsters. I came back a few minutes later, and there were none left, and I assume they were in a restaurant that night. So the problem that we have is that without a presence, a ranger or a warden or somebody rather on site, we are going to not be able to ensure that things are safe.
I mean, we have police on the railway stations all over Melbourne.
Yeah.
Why don't we have somebody down there permanently?
Why don't we? Yeah.
What are you doing about it?
Well, I'm actually talking to the mayor in about 10 days, so I'll bring that up. One other thing which is interesting is that some individual decided that he wanted to have abalone down there. So he went to the abalone aquatic centre where they breed them for restaurants and so on, and he got a whole lot of them and brought them down to Rickett's Point. And he put them in. He or she, I have no idea because I don't know who did it. And they are hybrids. Now hybrids are okay if they're in a lab, but in the marine environment at Rickett's Point, where it's not so protected, within probably 5 days they were all dead. They were washed up everywhere, which was quite sad in a way, but it should be done carefully. And I wouldn't be introducing hybrids, I'd be introducing what species should be there. That's one of the problems.
I have a question about, if you have an invasive species that came to Rickett's Point and had the potential, or it did in fact look like it was going to perhaps wipe it out for a 50-year period or something like that, and yet there were scientists who were saying that's part of the natural world, that we ought to not get in the way and interfere with something that would destroy things, because that happens in nature, and yet in our lifetime it might be a terrible thing. Where do you get the balance?
Well, two things. The first thing is that they don't have to be from overseas to be invasive. It can be for example, what we call the urchin barons. Now these are sea eggs or echinoderms. They reach explosive numbers sometimes, and they just eat everything. And they are native, they're endemic to the area. There has been a policy where people have been encouraged to try and reduce the numbers of them, and that's not unreasonable to do that. And I think that's happened at Rickett's Point, where put a knife through them and kill them. But often what happens then is they spawn, a whole lot of eggs being produced. But I think what it comes back to is that For example, the seaweed. There's too much seaweed there now. It's not actually helping, and it's discouraging utilization of the beach and ownership of the resources there by people, especially children. And so there needs to be a group that decides, okay, well, we can leave some there, but not the whole part. It's a huge area of that seaweed. And you saw what it's like. It's very thick. It's like oil almost that's come up there. And that is impacting other creatures on the system. In one sense, you could say that's invasive. Because it lacks the things that would break it down, I think there is a need for us to seriously consider removing some of it.
Next question, John.
John, thank you very much for your informative presentation. Could you make a comment on what is the potentially coastal erosion in our area?
Okay, I could have done that. I spoke a lot about that in Germany because they're saying they face the same problem as we do. Coastal erosion is very interesting because if you look at old photographs in the area that's around it, you find there are cliffs there. So what does a cliff mean? A cliff means that it is eroding, and it has been eroding for centuries. The rocks around here are around about 5.5 million years old. They were deposited subsurface and they've been uplifted since. They weren't deep water, so they haven't moved very far, but they will erode and cliffs form. I think that if you assume that it's going to be a static system, you're wrong. You never ever have that with nature. So we have the presence of cliffs and the presence of erosion. What we need to do is make sure that the erosion doesn't negatively impact on infrastructure. Now, over in Western Harbour, over here, I was over there about 10 years ago. They're very worried about some of the things that were happening over there. One of the problems was that somebody had introduced a New Zealand mangrove. I'm not sure if it was a mangrove or was actually living in the water and slowing down erosion. Now, they decided because it was not a native, they were going to take it out. So they whipped it out, and of course, that accelerated erosion. So then they were saying, well, what can we do to stop this? And the ideas that came up, that they float big sausage, huge sausage offshore, filled with sand that would actually intersect wave base and prevent big waves crashing into the shore. That's been done in part. There are many ways you can prevent erosion. If you have a look when you fly into Hong Kong airport, one of the most interesting things there is they've got these 4-footed pods that they interlock everywhere. What they do is they actually intersect the waves. They reduce the energy of the wave, which is a big problem, and presumably prevent or lower the erosion rate. And I could have shown you photographs, and I'm sure most of you have seen them of what it's like walking along that wonderful little walkway between Black Rock and Beaumaris that goes some distance along there. But every now and then there's a big storm comes, and blocks of basalt that are this big, weighing well over a ton, are just popped off. The forces, the hydraulic forces, are phenomenal when you get a storm. So we can't stop it, but we've got to learn to live with it and to minimise the impact on our infrastructure.
Next question, David.
You spoke about takeaway areas, and I'm under the understanding that there are quite a few in Australia. Like I lived in Tasmania. I think down here there's a no takeaway area there, which has been very successful in multiplying the number of fish. Are there quite a few takeaway areas in Australia? No takeaway areas in Australia?
Yes, the only thing you're supposed to take from these sanctuaries, as I said before, are memories and photographs. You are not expected to fish in them. And there are signs, I think there's a sign just over here, this way, saying no fishing in one.
Peter.
We hear a lot about global warming,
Yes.
particularly in relation to the Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
Raising to be extremely concerned about what's happening there. Can you give me a comment of that? Because you're talking about it being a very natural process.
Yes.
There's nothing they can do.
I wasn't going to talk about global warming. Yesterday in the weekend, I went for a swim and I nearly died. It took me at least 2 hours to thaw out. And I said to some colleagues at the Surf Lifesaving Club, you've got to burn more coal. And when I became aware of the fact that there is scientific consensus that global warming is a fact. Whenever somebody says that, I worry. And as a geologist and being aware of climate change, as most of you are aware, the period we're in now is rather cool compared with what it's been like in the past. And if you go back to the Paleocene, it's called a thermal maximum. Carbon dioxide levels then were about 6,000 parts per million. And surprise, surprise, nothing died. And I have another colleague of mine, Marcus Buckridge, who's a professor of botany in Brazil, and he has built a large greenhouse and he's artificially increased the CO2 levels because there was the concern that's been promulgated by Penny Wongs and Chris Bowens that CO2 is a poison. So that's loosely putting it. He found that instead of dying back, the trees just went really fast and grew faster than you'd ever seen before. So carbon dioxide is potentially a very valuable thing to develop. The coal seams we all enjoy are from the Paleocene period. That's when a lot of it formed. Now, I'm not saying that global warming doesn't occur. Of course it occurs. We can go back in time and we can see that there have been periods where it's been ice ages, during the Permian, for example, and periods when it's been very much hotter than it is now. So the Earth is not static, just as our coastal erosion is never expected to be static. But I think that there are a number of problems that exist in the way in which Australia in particular is tackling this. One of the rather curious things is that our CO2 emissions, if you want to measure things by that, are very, very small. I think they're 1/40th of the emissions that China emits without coal. So think about that. So can we do anything? Almost certainly not. Whatever we do is going to make no difference. But it's quite nice. I mean, I always said to students, if you see a Coca-Cola can or a beer bottle lying on the ground, pick it up, because even that simple action will make a difference. One of the things that I worry about is the fact that there is a huge polarization on carbon at the moment, which means that other things that are causing huge problems, microbe, for example, in the environment, are being missed. Here's a long answer to a question, but you asked it, and I didn't put it up to it. I said I was at a conference in Pakistan not so long ago, and one of the things that we were looking at were these chemicals such as DDT, which are being used to control pests like cockroaches. And in Bangladesh, they were catching fish, drying them in the sun, and then dusting them with DDT because they couldn't afford to pay for refrigeration. And the DDT was being manufactured in India against international protocols and exported to them. These sort of things, a huge problem with the environment. And I think for us to be totally focused on one thing is very dangerous indeed.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Evan.
First of all, just a quick comment on AI and the fascination with it. Animal scientists have been employing it for 70 years. It's called artificial insemination. I'm increasingly concerned about the number of days that the EPA say are not good for swimming. And I'm wondering, in view of some people's interest in building multi-rise apartment blocks all along Bayside, what are we doing to mitigate the effect that stormwater on the environment in the bay? And is it serious? It seems to me that there's 5 million people contributing to that, and compared to a few individuals taking a squat crab, that's a big threat.
Yeah, I agree. That was just an illustration. But one of the problems is the infiltration of storms and rainfall into the ground is now being inhibited by concrete, bitumen buildings, the whole lot. So there's, rather than actually going into the ground, it's now running straight off into the stormwater and out to the bay. And the flooding will be more common because of that, because it's just the water is not actually being sucked into the ground. That's a partial answer, but that's,
When I worked at the EPA many years ago, the E. coli counts were highest next to the stormwater drain, and it was found that the major source of the E. coli bacteria was dog dropping.
I just ask your opinion on on the possibility of an algal bloom like South Australia happening here.
when you increase the amount of fertiliser, which we can do very easily into the water around here, an algal bloom is possible. Yeah, there are different conditions between us and South Australia, obviously, but an algal bloom is not impossible.
One last question.
We've recently been advised about claims on tidal, Melbourne and beyond. Is this or these going to have an impact on the reserves?
Yes.
In any way?
Yeah, they probably will, yes. I think we have to wait and see what happens. If we can look at reserves overseas, New Zealand is a very interesting example. Some of the areas that now put aside are for Indigenous people only. I'm sure that would happen around Port Phillip. But there's an exclusive club developing with Indigenous peoples, and that can have ramifications.
I call on Roger Wilson to be our thanker.
Gentlemen, I'm sure you'll all agree we've been privileged to hear a world-renowned expert in various fields in answering the questions today. John, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And we've learned a lot today. And we wish you well in travelling the world and giving your wonderful knowledge. Congratulations, well done.
Thank you very much.